Hi, I'm Steve Sensenig.
And I'm Raborn Johnson, and you're listening to Beyond the Box.
Beyond the Box is a community of people who are learning how to live beyond the limitations of institutional religion. We are searching out a message that is truly good news for everyone.
Through discussions, interviews, group casts, and online interactions, we endeavor to foster a safe place to discuss our spiritual journey. We don't have all the answers,
but we are not afraid of any question.
So, grab a seat,
pour yourself a drink,
and join in the community that is
Beyond the Box.
Beyond the Box.
Well, welcome back to Beyond the Box, everyone. It is great to be back with you today. Today, I am joined by someone that many of you are probably already familiar with. His name is Jim Palmer, and Jim has just been, we had a great conversation over these 2 hours that you're going to listen to here, and Jim has just been an influence on me for a number of years now. I left the institutional church, stepped down from pastoral ministry in 2006, and it was shortly after that I began to read Jim Palmer's books. The first one I read was Wide Open Spaces. And in Wide Open Spaces, Jim just really was one of the first people that I found in print that gave you permission to kind of be free of the religious rituals that many of us had inherited from our evangelical upbringing. Jim is just a unique voice on the landscape of spirituality. You're going to hear a lot of things in this conversation. We go in all sorts of different directions. Much of it is spurred by Jim's latest book called Notes from Over the Edge. I think you're just really going to enjoy this conversation. There's a lot in here to chew on, to meditate on. There's going to be a lot of things you might resonate with, a lot of things you might not resonate with, a lot of things you might say, hey, I need to put that on the shelf and think about it and think about the implications of it. Feel free to do that. As anything you hear on this podcast, as we used to say on our bumper, Steve and I, years ago, we're just two guys thinking out loud. We don't have all the answers, and neither does Jim, and Jim will readily admit that. So if you hear some things that resonate with you, please take them, use them to grow in your walk with God. If it's something that you can't resonate with, that's fine. Just put it on a shelf and think about it later. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jim Palmer. Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Let's jump right in. Well, once again, let's try this again, Jim. We are in a lovely sunny day in Nashville, Tennessee, and I am happy to be joined by Jim Palmer. Jim, welcome to Beyond the Box.
Thanks, Ray. I'm really looking forward to just sitting and chatting with you out here in kind of a chilly morning, but the temps are going up, so it's good to be out here.
That's right. We have already had to be flexible this morning. We started out in one room, but there was a lady that was on an exercise machine beside us, so we figured all you guys out there in listening land didn't want to hear the squeak in the background, so we came out here beside a nice stream and a pool, and it's actually it's went from the single digits to we're almost in the 50s today. So
yeah, it feels good. It's going to be a good day.
It's really not that bad. Jim, there's so many of the people on the podcast in the community that already know who you are, that are already following you on Facebook, that are already familiar with your life, with your story. But for those of us who aren't, and those of us who have just joined the conversation, talk to us a little bit about your journey. I know that you have left institutional Christianity. Just to give you a little bit on Steve and I, the two hosts of the podcast, we both were pastors in an institutional church, have kind of ran the gamut within institutional Christianity. And what's funny is in 2006 is when I stepped down from ministry. And one of the first books I read after leaving the church was Wide Open Spaces. And it's funny when
I'm sorry.
No, that's a good thing.
Okay.
When I left back in 2006 and read that book, that was one of the first times I felt like I had permission to actually put down the Bible for a while and try to hear God apart from the Bible. I was at a place where I was reading the Bible. I had this conviction that I needed to be reading the Bible 3 times a day. The thought was in my head, if I eat 3 times a day, I've got to feed myself spiritual food 3 times a day.
Yeah.
And so I was reading the Bible 3 times a day, and your book came along at just the right time, gave me permission to...
And then you stopped reading the Bible.
And then, not completely, but a whole lot more than I was, that's for sure. But talk to us a little bit about your journey and how you found yourself outside of institutional Christianity.
Well, I guess a good place to pick up the story is in Chicago, where I went to seminary at Trinity Divinity School. And when I was in Chicago, I discovered Willow Creek. And so I was a staffer at Willow Creek Church for a few years, and was really compelled by their more contemporary style of ministry, wanting to connect with people who were not necessarily, engaged by the typical ways people were doing church. So I was on staff at Willow Creek, and then I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and I planted and pastored Springbrook Community Church, which was a non-denominational church that had some similarities to Willow Creek. And I was a senior pastor at that church for a number of years, and of course, as a pastor of a church and having a seminary divinity degree, that people kind of look to you to kind of parse out, theology, what it is to know God.
To be the expert.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I was certainly in that role, I delivered sermons, a few times on Sunday morning and Wednesday nights, and was a resident theologian, and pastor. But then I went through a period where I began realizing that despite all my good theology and all my knowledge and my degree, and, that there was an element in my own personal life where I didn't seem to be experiencing the peace and freedom that I often told people they could have by doing and believing the right things. And I also noticed this in my in the church that I was leading, that a lot of the personal challenges and problems and issues that people were having just kept resurfacing. So there wasn't the kind of deep transformation, that I saw in people's lives. I think for me a very memorable moment was when a woman in the church gave me a call and asked if I could meet her for lunch, and so I went and had lunch with her, and I could tell she was a bit distraught. I mean, it's a little unusual to get that call, and while we were together, she was wearing a long skirt and pulled up a portion of her skirt so I could see the bottom of her legs, and she was battered and bruised.
Wow.
She was married to our drummer in the worship band.
Wow.
And so that was a real eye opener. Okay, let me see if I can get this straight in my head. The guy who's playing drums in our worship band every Sunday beats his wife.
Wow.
So I had another conversation with a gentleman who, was, suicidal, and one of the main things that was driving that depression and suicide in his life was that he was gay, and didn't feel like he could be honest about that in our church. So I stepped back from all this, and it was like, okay, something's not right. Something doesn't seem right with me internally, and something doesn't seem to be right with the people that file in every day. We all have the quote unquote right and correct information about God. We're all Orthodox Christians. I'd learned Greek and Hebrew and sat under some great theologians, and so the information seemed right, but it wasn't making a difference in people's lives. So that was the beginning of me stepping back and starting to ask some really difficult questions about what it is I believed exactly and why, and what was the disconnect between my theology and my personal life and the lives of others. So ultimately, that led me out of, I decided to leave ministry, that I wanted to explore this and need to explore this further for myself. And it was really a crisis, a spiritual crisis for me. And it was about that time that I wrote, shortly after that, my first book, Divine Nobodies.
Yeah.
And the subtitle of that book is Shedding Religion to Find God and the Unlikely People Who Help You. Each chapter in that book is a story that revolves around an unsuspecting person that I crossed paths with in life that challenged what I thought about God, what it means to know God, about human beings, about life.
Yeah.
So there's a chapter in there about a waitress at Waffle House, a car mechanic, a tattoo artist, people that God used to kind of shake up all the assumptions I had about people in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
So I wrote Divine Nobodies, and I think it basically gave people permission to look at their own faith and question things, and maybe to acknowledge things in themselves that they didn't feel comfortable being able to do, in their particular, spiritual religious community. I found that to be true in general, that most people know the truth. The only thing holding them back is that they doubt what they already know and just need a little bit of permission, encouragement to listen to their own internal guidance.
Yeah.
So I wrote Divine Nobodies, and I got a ton of emails from people who were both pastors and members of churches and Christians who were struggling in their faith. And I noticed that one of the patterns I saw was that people are obviously disappointed, disillusioned, disenchanted with organized religion.
Yeah.
And so, my inbox was full every day with people who were expressing this. Then I also noticed in time that people were getting stuck there. It's always easier.
In the negative.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not that difficult. It's a little easier to be able to find what's wrong.
It's easy to diagnose
Right.
the problem. It's harder to solve it.
Right. So that's what really motivated me to move on in my own spiritual journey and to write Wide Open Spaces. And Wide Open Spaces was, if all we're going to do here is bitch and moan and gripe about what's wrong with church and ministers and pastors and religion, it's got to go further than that.
Yeah, yeah.
So what would be the alternative? And so I set out to experiment with the alternative. What would it mean to know God outside of the mentalities, the boundaries, the beliefs and practices.
I love what your subtitle for that book, Beyond Paint by Number Christianity.
Yeah, the idea with that is, and that really came from, the story behind that was that I had this bright idea that my daughter and I were going to paint together, and I think, she was, maybe 10 or 11 years old at the time. So we went to Hobby Lobby, and I thought, it'd be easy. I'll just get with these paint by number things. It should be easy. And, I got the thing, it was like a horse, and there were all these little pieces to it, and it was impossible. It was the most, it was terrible. It was like the worst experience. Okay, it'd be easier to just throw this out, and just get a big sheet of white paper, and just be able to paint and enjoy it, and not try to fit everything into these little minute lines. It wasn't even possible.
Fit everything in the box.
Right. So Wide Open Spaces, each chapter revolves around a question that I had to really struggle through. Do I believe in prayer? And if I do, what is it for me now? If church isn't this, then what is it? If the Bible, what is the Bible? Is Satan and evil and the way that we learn about it in Orthodox Christianity, how does that line up with my personal experience? And so every chapter revolved around one of these questions I had to struggle through in terms of an alternative. And I have to say that I deconstructed a lot of my Christianity away, but the piece of it that I could not deconstruct away was Jesus.
Yeah.
The more I found myself kind of, moving away from Christianity or Christian as a label for myself, I was only becoming more intrigued with Jesus and realizing that I'd only really scratched the surface on understanding even who Jesus was and his life and messages.
Yeah.
His message. So that's where Being Jesus in Nashville came.
You've just described where a lot of people on the podcast in our community are at right now.
Yeah, so that's, once I separated Jesus from Christianity, there was a Jesus before Christianity, obviously, and then there's what Christianity did to Jesus, and in some cases, it's a much, it's kind of a spiritually dumbed down Jesus than I think the authentic, real Jesus was. But it became a real, challenge for me. Am I going to give up Christianity, lock, stock, and barrel, which means, giving up any relationship or connection with Jesus. Because I mean that happens a lot. I mean, I got plenty of emails from people during that wide open spaces phase that were done with religion in every sense, God, Jesus, and everything else.
Yeah.
So
well, and the interesting thing before you go to Being Jesus in Nashville, those first two books, I worked in Christian retail for about 15 years, in the midst of pastoring as well. And we just got the drink machine on for all you people out in listening land, so it's all good. You'll get past it. But anyway, I worked in Christian retail, and your books were widely available. The first two, very, very big sellers. You received a lot of notoriety as a result of those. And then came Being Jesus in Nashville, for which you were slated to have the third big selling book that everybody's going to celebrate. Tell us what happened after that.
Well, a couple things were happening. Like some friends of mine. Well, here's how it started. Some friends of mine who were are identified with at the time, well, I guess would still now be referred to as the emergent church.
Yeah.
Brian McLaren, Tony Jones.
Many of the people we've had on the podcast.
Yeah. So, Brian McLaren and Tony Jones both endorsed Divine Nobodies and Wide Open Spaces, which put me then in the camp of the emergent church, which isn't a very good camp to be in if, for example, Lifeway Christian.
If you want to be published by Nelson or Zondervan or
So little things started popping up here and there. Lifeway, for example, stopped carrying at least Wide Open Spaces and maybe even Divine Nobodies because of that connection to the emergent church.
Wow.
And specifically Brian, McLaren's endorsement, because I think they quit carrying Brian's books altogether.
That's the kiss of death for some. I worked in a Lifeway store. Actually, it's funny, Jim, because you and I, our journeys intersect more than you know. You grew up in Blacksburg. I went to the first Bible college I attended was in Christiansburg.
Okay.
So, I was selling Pepsi at Virginia Tech, the
I didn't know
games.
there were Christians in Christiansburg.
Yeah, really. Do you remember on 81, as you go up 81, do you remember where the minaret is? That was like a Muslim retreat center?
Yeah.
Well, the Foursquare Church bought that compound, turned it into a Bible college. I attended Bible college there for a while, ended up leaving and going out west and going to Bible college. But anyway.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Blacksburg, and even though I didn't do my undergraduate there, I've always been a Hokie fan.
Hokey, hi.
Yeah, I actually devoted Wide Open Spaces to the students and the professors that lost their lives, and which I think is still one of the worst, university killings that have taken place in the U.S. So I've got a lot of friends back in Blacksburg. Yeah, Being Jesus in Nashville was a train wreck in a lot of ways. I mean,
but what's funny is in the midst of that, talking about that, I actually was working at Lifeway when I was in Bible college. When they started pulling, that's when the mass exodus of books started happening.
Yeah,
they were pulling everybody, not
Rob
Brian McLaren, Rob Bell. They were pulling Joyce Meyer, T.D. Jakes. Anybody with which they didn't agree, and it's not exactly hard to understand because, like for instance, what you're doing in those first two books are basically deconstructing the principles that the denomination which hosts Lifeway is all about.
Thomas Nelson, that's their core constituency.
Yeah.
What was interesting is after Wide Open Spaces, there was a tremendous amount of interest in Being Jesus in Nashville. And there were a few, it came down to a few publishers, but people were very interested in the idea of the 1 year journey of trying to determine what was the significance of Jesus outside of organized religion. Now, there was an interest in that, at one level, but there was always sort of an open-ended question about, anytime you write like a 1 year book, you're writing the book as it's happening. You don't know what the ending's going to be.
Yeah.
But that's one of the reasons why those books are interesting. It's kind of like, here's my memoir journey of what's happening while it's happening.
Yeah.
And so the more I wrote the book, the more, my publisher didn't like the way it was unfolding. Yeah. And, and the fact, an interesting about it was that, there was so much controversy over the book. I think mainly because people saw in it, the one thing that you can't do with any Christian publisher, at least more conservative Christian publisher, is get too involved in the question of the divinity of Jesus. Once you start stirring around in that pot, then your days are kind of numbered.
Yeah, definitely.
And even though my books have always been story oriented, and I've never been a writer trying to like push or establish a specific theological position. In some of my ponderings and dealing with the issues around, which I really wouldn't even say were so much about the divinity of Jesus as much as they were understanding myself in relationship to Jesus, that this got very uncomfortable. For the publishing house, and so ultimately the decision was that the book fell outside of Orthodox biblical Christianity, and therefore it could not be, they would not publish the book. So they canceled my contract. They decided that they couldn't publish that book because it was not an Orthodox Christian book. And so there was, now the fascinating thing is that over the course of writing that book, I went back and also did a lot of personal research and investigation of, church history, which is an interesting thing that when you look at some of the earliest church fathers and themselves trying to work through the issues that were kind of coming up during that year of my being Jesus, it's one of those things where it's a real eye-opener.
Yeah, it is.
To see how the issues of the divinity of Jesus were kind of formulated in church history and the church councils and some of the differing of opinions about it. So, that launched my journey into self-publishing. I mean, there was always in the back of my mind the realization that I had to be careful. Even all the way back in Wide Open Spaces, like I'd get my manuscript back and there'd be some recommendations on some things to change, I did that. But I could see that it wasn't going to be possible to write any more books for a Christian publisher.
You wouldn't be left with much, right?
So that I self-published Being Jesus in Nashville, and then I decided to, and so after spending a year and, really trying to uncover how Jesus was relevant for me, which wasn't really a theological question at all. I mean, it was more going out into the world and living my life to see what it was about Jesus that was relevant and central to my spirituality. And, ultimately I came to see that there is a universal and inclusive significance that Jesus has for every human being, regardless of their religious tradition or their philosophical beliefs or their spiritual sentiments. I mean, Jesus himself had a religious tradition. Which he was both a supporter and critic, depending on what the scenario was. So I very much don't see Jesus as a religion. One can have a religious tradition and still appreciate, apply, and walk in the truth that Jesus taught and lived. So after Being Jesus in Nashville, the real question, a question that really became front and center for me was the issue of suffering. It's kind of like I went full circle, remembering the gal who was being beaten by her husband, who was in our worship band, thinking about all the people who were wrapped up in a lot of inner drama and all kinds of religious pathologies and personal life issues that weren't being worked out. And so what I began to see is that religion has a lot of answers about how to die, and what's going to happen when you die, how to die, and all that. But it doesn't do as a good a job of addressing how to live.
I like the way you say it in the book that they've got a lot of answers for the afterlife, but not for the here life.
Here life, right? And so that was happening a little bit. That was gradually happening with me anyway, where I was becoming less interested. I was becoming less interested in hell, more interested in suffering, less interested in heaven, more interested in the present reality of God's kingdom.
Yeah.
Less interested in doctrine and creed, more interested in ground truth that you need on a day-by-day basis to live. So the issue of personal suffering became front and central. And so I wrote, there's like 5 sections in the book, and they are in a way, I guess, a sort of like, maybe in some way a conclusion to my journey of deconstructing my faith. Because the first section is really about how to know the truth. Like, it's almost like that quote on education that, I think Margaret Mead said that we don't need to teach our children what to think, we need to teach them how to think.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing with, we don't need to tell people what the truth is. Where we can be useful is maybe encourage people on how to know the truth.
Yeah.
And so the first section of the book really focuses on that piece of it, and what I learned, in terms of how to know the truth, how to move past the typical ways that we've learned to know anything. Then the second chapter goes into some detail about how, the issue of personal suffering. What is the source of it? What is the cause of it? How do we fix it? And where can we find and anchor this truth in, the things that Jesus lived and taught?
Yeah.
Now Jesus wasn't the only one that talked about it, but I have a Christian background, not a Buddhist background. So
Right.
although I know, things, I have a knowledge of Buddhism, my own personal situation in life is the Christian background.
Yeah.
So I kind of wrote it from that background.
Yeah.
There's a couple of sections that specifically deal with how to untangle oneself from religious pathology, and places to dig down into Christian theology, where we might have learned some very fundamental things that we projected onto the Bible that have really thrown us off on our spiritual journey. And then the very last section of the Bible is just the Bible.
See, we can't even do it here, right? I mean, the deconstruction process continues.
Yeah. The very last section of the book is applying what I've said in the first part of the book in 2 difficult situations: mental illness and domestic violence. Because my thought there was that, look, if the truth doesn't work in those 2 cases, then I don't know, is it really true?
Right.
And I do get a lot of emails from people that will say, well, what about a person who's got clinical depression, they're bipolar, they suffer from other mental disorders or disease, and I've also dealt with kind of worked with people who are victims of domestic violence, and that's one of the worst situations that one can be in. And does the truth work, or is it just pie in the sky stuff that doesn't really apply?
Yeah.
I had someone make a comment the other, I talked a lot about my belief in the goodness of people, but it's not a naive belief. I spent years traveling the world doing human rights work, and was posed as a customer in brothels where 10-year-old girls were raped, 3 or 4 times a day, 6 days a week, and child slave camps where kids are whipped with electrical cords if they don't meet their quota of rolling cigarettes.
Wow.
So in some ways I've seen the worst of it, but
and that was with International Justice Mission,
yeah,
was it?
Yeah. So Notes from Over the Edge, then I also self-published because I was at that point a little gun-shy about having too many hands in what the final message was going to be, and self-publishing has become a much more viable option for authors.
That's actually what I do for a living, is I work for Lightning Source.
Okay.
So yeah.
It's the traditional publishing, the value usually had something to do with distribution. But because most people get their books online,
and Christian bookstores aren't going to carry your books anyway, right?
Right.
So
and I talked to some publishers that are more mainstream spirituality publishers, but still, it's self-publishing's a
You have
great
full control.
possibility.
You get to put out there what you want to put out there
Yeah.
without worrying about somebody hacking it.
Yeah, and the other thing is the publishing house, you also would think that you would get a lot of marketing. You do some, but it still kind of depends. I mean, I think the publishing business in general is suffering a little bit, and so usually publishing houses are going to put their money behind, their biggest author.
Exactly.
So if you're either up and coming author or you're a kind of a middle range author, unless you're Stephen King,
Right.
it's
They're basically going to tell you, go get a blog, go do
right.
social media.
Go do social media, which I
Basically,
already do.
Do it yourself.
Yeah.
So why, what am I dependent on you for, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's at the end of the day. The Notes from Over the Edge, I found myself very much with your first 3 books, just really walking lockstep in many ways with where you're at. And, we're all on this journey, and I'm still very much in this process of going, what's the end game here?
Yeah.
Where am I at? So I read Notes from Over the Edge, and it really challenged me. I mean, there's some areas I found real resonance with, and other ones where I went, I'll have to put that one on the shelf and think about it, and somewhere I went, gosh, I'm just not ready to go there.
Yeah.
But I tell you, it stretched me, and that's what I like so much about your work is that regardless of whether or not someone is where you're at on the journey, they're affirmed in that journey. And the thing that really hit me, Jim, is a few quotes that you make in the book that Steve and I have really, something that we've stressed over the last 5 or 6 years of doing the podcast, is that religion has caused us not to trust ourselves. It's caused us to, because of the Augustinian version of the fall, and because of, all of these things we've had beat into us about how, the heart's deceitful and wicked, desperately wicked, and, that there's a way that seems right to a man. There's all these things that tell us don't trust your heart.
Yeah.
And then someone like you comes along and says, like this is something you say from the book, it's time to forge a new and trusting relationship with yourself. Talk some about how you find yourself more and more feeling your way through life instead of thinking your way through life.
Well, it's definitely been a challenge for me personally, not only because of learning that same thing through religion, which is that I'm inherently untrustworthy.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing about that is that the people, if this is true, then the people telling me that would be just as untrustworthy.
Isn't
So
that funny
with
that
the
it never applies to the authority, right?
Right. The logic of me that
You can't trust you, that's why you got to trust me.
Right. We're all cut out of the same cloth. So, the other thing to me, though, is that, I grew up with a mother who was alcoholic. So I became codependent. And what codependency is, or was for me, is that you defer what's inside of yourself to placate or please or fit in with what you expect from other people. So I kind of had 2 reasons that made it difficult for me to even get down to even knowing what I did think or feel about anything.
Wow.
I closed that door early on in my youth, and then religion kind of, locked it for good.
Filled the vacuum,
Yeah,
right?
saying that I could, I could never really trust myself. So it included going back and challenging the first and fundamental principle that I took into myself, which is that I'm inherently bad. So it took some work around that particular issue. I even went back to Jesus and some of his teachings, the life and relationship he had with his disciples was, a contributing factor that, there's a way you can read the Gospels where it sure seems that Jesus is discouraging people from placing their dependency on Jesus as a human person. He is saying, I need to really die for all this to unfold, and the disciples are really against this because they become attached to Jesus the person. And Jesus' answer to that is, well, I need to go, otherwise you are going to get attached to Jesus the person, and you're never going to learn to follow the Spirit yourself. And as a way of kind of helping them get through that was a recognition that the truth of Christ, the Spirit of Christ, was going to be a reality that they could access inside themselves. That wasn't necessary for Jesus to be there in his human personhood for that connection to God and their spiritual life to be real. but the thing about religion for me also is it really complicated it. You know, it taught me to associate spirituality with a very, defined set of things. You know, I had the world divided up in spiritual and secular, and spiritual was go to church, read your Bible, meditate, do something to make a difference in the world, and everything else was, secular things that you just had to do, but it really didn't have a lot of significance. So, so part of it was the realization that all of life is spiritual, that there's nothing I have to do to really trump up my daily life to make it spiritual. Like there's not anything that needs to be added to the equation of my everyday life to make it more meaningful, more worthy, more spiritual, or more significant. That in a way, transformation is not seeing different things in your life, it's seeing what's already in your life differently. So spirituality is not something that you add to your life, it's just a mindset, it's a mindfulness of the way things really are and the way you carry that in everything that you do in life. Once I kind of uncovered and began to see the way everything is interrelated in life and in the world, and it wasn't long before I could see that the simplest acts of, being mindful of what's true, simple acts of love and kindness and compassion along the everyday paths of life, are far more significant than I imagined that they were back in my days when I was trying to launch revolutions and change paradigms and start movements and, all the big
save Christianity and all that.
Right. And all the, the big things that so it's kind of, because in a way it's so simplistic, it can be very difficult to get to. Like there is a scripture that says that God is love.
Yeah.
And so you could you could take that to mean that when I feel love for my children, when I express love along the everyday paths of my life, when people express love to me, in any moment I can stop and I can ponder the question, what does it mean right now for me to love in this particular situation, whatever it is or however mundane it might be.
Yeah.
Then I could conclude that every one of those experiences is my experience of God.
There's an interesting passage in 1 John that talks about, it says something to the effect of, no one's seen God at any time, but when we love, God is made manifest. It's like when you love, literally there's God. If you, you can't see him, but if you want a physical, corporeal, demonstration of God, there it is. And that just boggles my mind to think about.
I think one of the ways that Western Christianity gets in the way is it's so hung up on the way things appear, forms, of things, that we take everything that we see with our eyes to be the fundamental truth, and we have a very difficult time looking any further than that. And that's probably maybe why a lot of people become interested in Eastern spirituality, because they have a sense that there's got to be something more beyond what our sensory information tells us. It's people ask Jesus' main message in the Gospels was the kingdom of God has come. Repent, the kingdom of God is here.
Yeah.
And the response was, well, we don't see it, because they were expecting to see the kingdom of God.
When's it going to show up? Yeah.
Right. And then Jesus said, well, that you're not going to find it that way, because the kingdom of God is, it's present here, it's within us, it's around us. Hence the important word repent, which in my mind doesn't mean to be sorry for your past wrongs, but it means a fundamental shift in how you understand something.
Yeah.
And so I think that I don't think there's any greater significance in a person's life or any greater difference a person can make than to address the cause of their own suffering, to be mindful of the way things really are, and to take that mindfulness and live it and express it in everyday life. It doesn't matter if you're you know, a garbage collector hanging on the back of a garbage truck, or you know, your person who's in political office, or you know, you're an employee at Best Buy, or you know, you work in the IT field, or whatever. None of that matters.
Yeah.
You know, we can, no matter your circumstances, nothing is ever preventing us from knowing and being the truth, and nothing ever has to be added or changed. You know, the only qualifier for that would be, and is another unfortunate thing that I, you know, unfortunately in my kind of stripe of religion that I didn't get, is just the simplicity of responding to situations as they require. You know, that there's...
Feel like you always had to be ready to give an answer for the hope that lied within you, right?
Right. But because we tend to think that life has to be trumped up, you know, and even lately I've been thinking about, I mean, you know, even you don't have to read another spiritual book. You don't even have to be talking about God or theology. You know, no, these are all expressions that are meaningful to people, and so do them or don't do them. But what we do is we want to, you know, like ascribe some greater value to certain things. People would be so much better off in life in general if they would just respond to situations as they require. You know, like we've learned that families that pray together stay together, but that wasn't true in my experience. I mean, even in the church that I led, you know, we prayed all the time as a church, and you know.
Well, and there's your drummer
right,
playing every Sunday,
people got
right?
divorced, so
Yeah.
I like to say instead, you know, people in relationships who do the personal work to address their ways of being and their patterns that are destructive and not useful for a healthy and whole relationship, you know, have a good chance of staying together.
Yeah.
But you got to respond to the situation requires. It's the same thing with depression. You know, the people who learn, or for whoever's out there who still feels some stigma because of their religious past, because of their depression. You know, if I trip leaving today and I, you know, busted my head open, I'd go to the hospital and get treatment and wouldn't think twice about it.
Yeah.
You know,
And wouldn't feel guilty about it.
Right. A person who struggles with depression is no different from me busting my head open. And so the situation requires you to get help.
Yeah.
You know, and whatever. And, you know, depression's different for everybody,
Yeah.
and even what the response is. I'm not saying that there's just, but I'm just saying that just to respond as the situation requires.
Yeah.
You know, and that's one of the... Religion sometimes tries to spiritualize the circumstances of our lives and the situations that we're in, but sometimes we just fail to respond as it requires with, like, common sense and, you know...
Well, religion's taught us not to use, you know, your plain sense. It's basically taught you, like we were talking about earlier, because we've been taught that we're corrupt, that, you know, that God has a problem with us, that we should have a problem with us. Then we don't trust those natural inklings. I mean, you know, how many times during your journey did you think, you know, oh my gosh, I've got to make sure I pray enough or read the Bible enough or whatever to make sure that I don't miss the will of God, because if I miss it, you know, I'm always going to have to settle for Plan B,
right.
or the instead of the perfect will of God, the permissive will of God, right?
Right.
There's a lot of condemnation.
Yeah, which is another example of, you know, I think one of the other kind of fundamental flaws of a lot of religious thinking is the idea of separation. I'm separated from God, I'm separated from love, I'm separated from peace, I'm separated from God's will, and somehow I got to bridge that separation and figure it out.
Yeah.
And I think that gets us so turned around in our relationship with God, you know, and life,
Yeah.
that we're not separated from God's will. You know, that's not even, it's the same concept of if you could be separated from God, you know, which from the standpoint that I mean, I think sometimes it doesn't occur to people that if a person was capable of generating a self-existing life apart from God, they would be God themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the only reason why any of us is here is that we are, you know, born out of the likeness, the being of God. God's being is the ground of all living things. I mean, it wouldn't be possible to live if that, were not true.
Yeah.
And so I think in our most fundamental, original self, that we are connected to God, and that self took on a human body and a mind, and we're having a human journey. And Jesus talked about being in the world and not of the world, and kind of getting those two things straight seems to be like the wisdom of how to go through all this.
Yeah. You hit on something that I just found myself underlining and highlighting when you were talking about that. The truth of Jesus is that God and humanity are inseparable. I want to read a couple of quotes that you put. You said, Jesus said, I am the truth. What is that truth? It is the truth of no separation. It is the truth of the one reality. It is that truth and God, and that God and humankind are one. And then you said, Jesus is the truth, that God and humankind are one. The truth of Jesus is God and humankind are one. Jesus came to unmask the lie of separation which feeds your suffering. Jesus came to show that God and humankind are one, both divine and human, with no separation. For so long, and I'm still, I'm still in a place personally where I do see a special quality to Jesus.
Yeah.
More and more, that's been deconstructed as to what it used to be. I used to have Jesus on this level that was unattainable and otherworldly, and more and more I've seen that more of really like an Eastern Orthodox view of like theosis.
Yeah.
This idea that Jesus, through the incarnation, God was sending the message that God's will is a perfect amalgamation between God and human. And I tell you, Jim, I've kicked this around 100 different times, or 100 different ways. And, even one of the things I've thought is, the doctrine of the Trinity that we talk about within the church. One thing I found interesting, even in my days of very Orthodox Christianity, was the idea that, like, for instance, in the book of Revelation, when you get to Revelation, you hear about the Lamb and you hear about God. So you hear about Father and Son over and over and over and over, and you get to the New Jerusalem, and it continues to talk about the Lamb and God, but there's no Holy Spirit there. And it kind of hit me, even back then, that what that message was that because if the Spirit's there, it's a given that we're there, because like Paul said, he who's joined to the Lord is one Spirit with him.
Yeah.
That we're so united with God that the line between where God ends and I begin, that more and more that boundary for me has faded and disappeared to where I really see more and more that the whole purpose of the incarnation was the complete unity of God and man, to where there will not be, and I struggle with how to word that, because is there an ontological difference in eternity between God and me? I really don't know how to answer that, but simultaneously, in essence, I mean, even if you want to be an inerrantist, and even if you want to hold on to your Bible with both hands firmly, you have to admit it's all over the New Testament that God and us are completely unified, to the point that, Paul's even saying stuff like, or Jesus is even saying stuff like to Paul on the road to Damascus, you're persecuting me.
Yeah.
These people and me, we're the same deal.
Yeah. I think Jesus is very, impossible to understand in the ways that we tend to want to try to understand things. I think that I don't know how I missed it over having a seminary degree and, preaching.
Sometimes those are the biggest hindrance, right?
Yeah, preaching all those sermons that Jesus kept on saying, I am the truth. He didn't say, I know the truth, as if truth is a thing to be known, like a right kind of belief or doctrine or information or theology, He didn't say, I have the truth, like truth is, something that you hold, or an object that you then extend and give to someone else. Jesus said, I am the truth. It was a statement of being, that Jesus was saying that truth was who he was. It was on the level of being, that his very essence, that's something, something that just peeled the blinders off for me when I read that in your book. Was it's almost like I had this vision of that Jesus is like the prototype, that he is, that he's saying that the truth is who I am,
and that's who God wants you to be.
Right, and that is the same truth that you share.
Yeah,
you know, I think the reason why this is so difficult is that we're sometimes using the wrong equipment that we have in a way that's not going to work. You know, like that whole in the world and not of the world kind of mentality. And you know, I mean, I am in some ways an intellectual. I mean, sure. I read, I enjoy philosophy and all kind of sure. stuff. But in recent years, I've realized that, you know, most, you know, Westerners are particularly probably humans in general, but perhaps even more our sensibilities in the West, you know, are very dualistic. Yeah. You know, I mean, that's just the way the mind works dualistically. Yeah. You know, up, down, left, right, good, bad, human or divine. It can't be human and divine. Wow. And so what people are going to say is that's why we either have to say, Christians either have to say, or Orthodox Christians are either going to, they can't deal with human and divine, so it's either going to be Jesus is divine and kind of human, but not like we are, or, you know, then there's the other camps that can say Jesus was human, he wasn't divine at all. Yeah. You know, so there's a lot of different camps that try to, because they can't hold the idea at the same time of being both human and divine. It's got to be one or the other. They have to be in contradiction to each other. Yeah. And I think that, you know, it's difficult, you know, for that reason. I think, again, that's why Jesus said repent, for the kingdom of God is here, because that word repent is that going beyond the way we typically know things. So there's a way that the truth that Jesus is non-dualistic. Yeah. The bad news is that the mind cannot understand or compute a non-dualistic reality. It's not capable.
Talk about that, because that's one of the things you unpacked in the book that really hit me, was that I've never thought about, but even in our naming of something, that's an exercise in dualism, because you're basically creating a distinction and a separation that in reality is not there. I mean, that quantum physics tells us is not there.
Right, and the interesting thing about this conversation is even our conversation is trying to understand non-dualism. I mean, you know, like
in a dualistic conversation, right?
Right, and that's what's kind of like funny about it is that that's what sometimes I'll say is that, or what I realized for myself was that the end game was not to finally conceptualize with my mind the truth.
Right.
The end game was to let go of the need to conceptualize, because we tend as Westerners to think that there's only one way to know something, that's conceptualization of the mind. But we really know that that's not true. I mean, we've been talked into it. I mean, you can you know, go watch sunset and be present to it, and there's a set of things that you'll experience that you didn't necessarily get through, you know, with your mind. I mean, there's a scientific explanation for a sunset, and two people can be watching at the same time and be having two different experiences. So there is an intuitive, quiet, silent, and tacit understanding that you don't attain, you don't figure out. It's there. Yeah. Like it's you experience it. Almost like, you know, a server that gets pinged, you know, that part of that you that was born out of the image, likeness, and being of God has no need to attain or understand or figure out anything. You know, it
knows all things.
Right, it is all things. Yeah. I mean, like from the standpoint that it, you know, so the only thing that's really ever really happens is awareness or mindfulness, you know, and but it's not. That doesn't mean that distinguishing things or using our mind is, you know, because there's a lot of people that will make that wrong. You know,
like almost like a Gnosticism where they deny any kind of physicality.
Like there's no denying that there's a me and you.
Exactly.
And there's you know, the need to distinguish us as two separate people right now, you know, is what it means to be human beings. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, all I can speak to is, you know, there could be like 500 other existences, but the only one I know for sure is that this is a human existence. Yeah. And the way our human existence happens is through the ability to distinguish. That's the hard, and that's kind of like the tricky part is that there is separation. There is a you there and a me here, and there is space that's between us. I mean, that's the way it appears, and there is a way that we couldn't function unless we were able to, unless we could see that. But as you said earlier, we know that that's not the full truth, because even, quantum mechanics and quantum physics shows us that, wave particles actually connect us all together.
Yeah. Like string theory and stuff. I mean, that stuff will just mess with your brain when it comes to the interconnectivity of everything.
Yeah, so so the thing about it is it really is interesting that, at least for me, the journey was that it got highly, and I guess it's not really a linear thing. I think it kind of goes up and down and turns around, but there's sometimes when, where I go through these pockets of time where it ends up just being, very simple.
Yeah.
I mean, like, for example, if you read the Dalai Lama, it can drive you crazy because, he's a Buddhist monk, okay, and although maybe, and he's a very intelligent, his understanding of Buddhism is, obviously, unparalleled in his own right. He wouldn't be the Dalai Lama if that wasn't. But if you read his stuff, it's like, be good, be happy, love everybody.
Yeah.
Now, that's not. He speaks about Buddhism and stuff in a lot of other ways and so on. With a lot of, depth. But if you just went to his Facebook page where they have quotes and stuff, it's that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a way that, for me, that becoming very mindful of my path daily, thinking about being love and expressing compassion, that it's almost like in religion you learn that's kind of like the real important stuff is figuring it out in your head. You kind of do that on the side to be a good person, but it may be the reverse, that the way we actually deepen our spiritual lives is not adding more knowledge, because more knowledge doesn't even necessarily equal more understanding.
Yeah.
But it may be that, and I wrote about that some of being Jesus in Nashville. I find, what I began to see is that Jesus was special not because he was more divine than anybody else, but that he was more human.
Yeah.
And that I had a lot to learn from Jesus about really embracing the human journey.
Yeah.
And living it fully. So I think that we do slice up the world, we categorize it, we label it, we differentiate this from that. But then the mindfulness is to realize the one life that's beyond all those distinctions, all those categories, the one life that is beyond all those forms.
That's
and
right.
When we are mindful of that, then it filters down into how, I relate to you, or, my way of being in the world.
Well, and even you talking about mindfulness, that's something that you talk about in the book, being present, that, God is only in the present, that he's not in the future, that he's not in the past, and that we tend to, through the mind, that we tend to always live either in the future or in the past.
Because time itself is a function of the dualistic mind. It's our way of making sense of and marking out our human existence. But, our true self and God exists outside of space and time.
Well, and Einstein even showed us that time is totally relative. It's subjective. Yeah. So, for us to pour that in concrete is really, it's not only not spiritual, it's not even real in the material world.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why some people are, that there's a lot of, it's a good reason for some practice of meditation, although anything can be legalistic. Not only Christianity, also Buddhism.
Yeah.
I think, there's different, so you can be legalistic no matter what your tradition is.
You can be a grace Pharisee, right?
Yeah, right. But sometimes it can be useful to, some meditation in terms of perhaps becoming less distracted by what's present in your sensory experience, so that you can perhaps better be more mindful of what lies past it, because we stay so distracted. It's not even because of the distinctions themselves, but it's what we attach to them for our meaning. I mean, we have so many misplaced dependencies in our lives that it's not what we actually see, it's what we think it all means. And we get so distracted in that drama of separate people doing separate things, achieving separate things, and all this part of that, that it drowns out any recognition of the one life and the truth that lies, beyond it. Or it doesn't really even lie beyond it, it's present in it, but we're not mindful of it.
Exactly. That's one of the things that you said that I thought was so interesting is, you just mentioned meaning, and how a lot of the problem is not the everyday things that happen to us, but the meaning that we attach to them. One thing you said in the book that I thought was really interesting was you said, consider that you are the one who's creating the disturbance in your life by the meanings that you have attached to the things that happen. The misplaced iPhone did not cause your unhappiness. What you told yourself about it is what caused it. And then you said, stop being attached to ideas about how things should be, which I thought that was a really interesting thing, because, I can see that in my own life, that it's not really what happens to me, it's how I interpret what happens to me.
Yeah, and that's a good, a lot of people live their spiritual lives in their head. They can go their whole lifetime and work out spiritualities and mental exercise.
Yeah.
But the work is really in the daily practice, because of what you just said, is that life, we tend to think of life as being something that happens to us.
Yeah.
That we're sort of here and life happens and then I have to respond to it and it's just kind of happening to me. And I think what we miss is that, life is just what is happening and what it means. We're supplying the meaning to it. And once we supply the meaning to it, then that's determining our experience of life. So we're actually responsible for how we're experiencing life. Two people can be going through the same exact situation, but because of the meaning they're applying to it, their experience of it is going to be different. So in that sense, we are creating, what the meaning, or
we're creating our world, right? Yeah. The world we live in, we're
right,
creating
because
it.
we're adding what everything means, and that has to be worked out in practice.
Yeah.
And it's got to be like, it's on the equivalent of, I remember back in the day, even when I was a pastor, I would say, rather than reading through the Bible in a year, pick one thought and really focus on it. And so, to really be mindful of, because before we ever get out the door, we've rigged our entire day.
Yeah.
We're sabotaging ourselves at every turn.
Yeah.
Because we're so attached to it being a certain way. In fact, one of the biggest obstacles and stumbling blocks on the spiritual path is our insistence on things being a certain way. It's our attachments on how life must be.
Yeah.
But you have to really, it's a practice that you have to take through life. And a tool that you can use would be to think about responding to situations as they require, rather than trying to control life and how it shows up. And and I'm one of the. It's a challenge for me. I mean, I'm a very routine person, and I kind of like things that happen according to a routine. So when things don't happen in my routine, it can throw me off. So I have to, in those moments, I need that tap on the shoulder to be mindful that to not be so attached. But our attachments can be so problematic, because we think that we will be happy if certain circumstances and situations unfold in our lives. And this is often what motivates people's relationship with God, that, if I'm, if I'm doing well in my obedience to God or in my spiritual practices, that God will bless me. And that's another one of those fundamental flaws in religion, is the idea of God's blessing, which usually amounts to, the idea of God working out your circumstances in one way or another, and that's flawed because then the assumption is that happiness is somehow related to a set of circumstances, and it's not.
Well, don't you think that often that's used too as a like an authoritarian power play to keep the masses in line? I mean, without, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily intentional by people within the institutional church, like pastors and leaders, but I think that often that is used to keep people from embarking on the very journey that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some ways that religion convinces us to close our eyes to some of the most obvious truths, one of those being that the world is impermanent. Things don't change, they don't stay the same.
Yeah.
And no matter how hard you try, it won't happen.
Yeah.
There will be loss, there will be sickness, there will be death. And the idea that if I'm good, that God is going to somehow override the impermanence of life and make it more permanent for me is not real.
You were talking earlier before we started recording. We were talking about even your books and how people become attached to the Wide Open Spaces gym, or they become attached to the Being Jesus in Nashville gym, and how they assume when they read your book that when they contact Jim Palmer that he's going to be just like he was in 2006 when he wrote Wide Open Spaces.
Yeah.
And I've had the same thing. I mean, Steve and I have been doing the podcast for going on 6 years now, and people will listen to an episode from 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And they'll contact us now and ask us a question about it. And often, not only do we not even remember what we said,
right,
but when we do, sometimes we're like, I said that? Like,
Can I take
I don't
that?
believe that, So, I mean, it's one of those things that impermanence is something that we are quick to take into account when it comes into our natural circumstances in life.
Yeah.
But when it comes to our spirituality, it's things like creeds and dogmas and doctrines. I mean, the idea, the ironic idea to me, that we somehow need to be controlled by what happened at Nicaea or Chalcedon or Trent or whatever, that somehow those stationary, static decisions that were made hundreds of, if not sometimes 1,500 years ago,
Yeah.
that somehow that has to be completely, that it can inform where I'm at, but the idea that has to dictate where I'm at, I mean, that really goes against the grain of, the impermanence that we encounter on a daily basis. But don't you think that oftentimes we take that impermanence and the way that we explain it away is we say, well, God's eternal, God's unchanging, so His truth's eternal, His truth's unchanging, and therefore that's why I'm supposed to fall in line with that and not follow my, day by day leanings and intuitions and things like that. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think this is in my view, this is one of the big reasons why I think people misunderstand the Bible. Because I view the Bible as it's a spiritual story, it's a human story, it's a cultural story, it's a historical story, and it's all connected together into one collection of writings. So, in my view, the Bible is a story of humankind's relationship to and with God or the divine. And it's a story.
It's a messy story.
It's
just
a messy
like
story.
Our lives are pretty messy, right?
Right. And, sometimes that story, people's, their understanding of God leads to some of the most loving, compassionate, and beautiful things that happen in the world. Other times we rationalize our own intentions or project them on God and go out and do things that we claim that God told us to do.
Allah Canaanite genocide, right?
Right. So so I think that it's people miss that we are working out the truth in the context of a human experience, which means it's always going to be impermanent and shifting and changing and evolving. I mean, as culture changes and shifts, our understanding and application and expression of the truth, is going to be different. Maybe if on some other existence where, everything is marked by permanence, it'll be different, but that's not this one. That our human experiences, requires that we give expression to the truth that's inside of us according to, the human context that we're in.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it doesn't make sense to hold people to an expression of truth that, is no longer relevant to our history or culture or, our other aspects of our human lives in terms of, even our own culture. The missionaries, had a bad habit in the past, at least, perhaps true today, going around the world and, implanting Western culture and, as the
preaching American democracy as the gospel, right?
Yeah, and so again, we get so attached to the forms of things, and how they appear, and our attachments to forms, and I think that peace, freedom, well-being, that these qualities are inherent in our true self, and it is not necessary. What we do is though that we don't have a very good relationship with that self. We're told our problem is our relationship with God, but I think the problem really is our relationship with ourselves. And so therefore we go out in the world and we form attachments to impermanence, and it's never going to work, because it doesn't last. There's nothing wrong with the world because it's that way. That's the way this is supposed to be. This is the way it was for Jesus. Jesus experienced loss, grief, and the full experience of the impermanence of the world. And inside that impermanence, Jesus said the kingdom of God is here.
Yeah.
But it's not good. It doesn't get established as in the way that people were. So there is an element where love and freedom and peace is not contingent upon any set of circumstances. You can be an expression of all those and experience them within yourself.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that circumstances don't matter.
Right.
If that's why I wrote those chapters in Notes from Over the Edge. If I sat with someone and they said I'm currently a victim of domestic violence, I wouldn't send them home and say, well, don't worry about it. Your true peace comes from inside yourself, and just continue as you are. I would say no. I would say, the part of skillful living is responding to situations as they require. Yeah. And a situation where you're subjected to another person's abuse, that situation requires for you to remove yourself from that abuse and from your abuser. I sometimes wish, while people are like debating and arguing theology and all sorts of things, they would maybe think about this on broader terms, in terms of the world itself.
Yeah.
Like what does the situations of the world require? And people's tendency to want to talk about evil and the hardships of the world, and from a theological point of view, and why does God allow this kind of stuff? And rather than seeing the fact that we are the ones are creating the experience of the world through the choices that we make, and so God's not. We're the ones who are responsible for the conditions of the world.
Yeah.
The good news is, because of that, then
we can fix it, right?
Right. we can do something about it.
Yeah.
This is what kind of is fascinating about the idea of praying about something. Is I'm not saying that there aren't a lot of value in prayer, and people that think about prayer differently, but looking at it as going into the world and being Jesus to bring that change, rather than sitting back and expecting God to somehow do it as outside of human agency. It's easy to go there.
I think you really nailed one of the things that we've talked a lot about on the podcast is the idea of mimetic theory. I don't know if you're familiar with Rene Girard or mimetic theory, but anyway, a lot of it, I won't go into all the details, but a lot of it has to do with competition and how we tend to believe that the resources that we need are limited and scarce, and therefore, we get in competition with others, which leads to violence, which leads to the problems that we have in the world. And one of the things you hit on in the book, which I thought was interesting, you said we view this world of somebody's through the lens of scarcity. Talk some about that, and in you just talking about how we are basically creating the world we're living in. We create those problems, and that we can also fix them. maybe talk about how that idea of scarcity and viewing others through the lens of scarcity, how that's caused us to end up with the world that we have right now, and maybe how we can get out of that.
Yeah. Well, it's also a cultural thing a bit, that Americans tend to be more individualistic. There are other cultures that are more collectivistic, but America tends to be a little bit more individualistic, where I see myself as an individual and what I need and want in the world, and so now we're competitors because I'm not going to be able to get mine if you have it, so we become competitive with each other. A more collectivistic view would be to think about the importance of a world that works for everyone. And we've had people come along and express that. Martin Luther King Jr. was one.
Yeah. The Poor People's Campaign. I mean, that was...
Yeah. Martin Luther King Jr., he had a very... his spiritual understanding was, quite profound.
Yeah.
In terms of his belief in the interrelatedness and interconnectedness of all things.
Yeah.
Some people don't realize some of Martin Luther King Jr.'s thoughts along these lines. He's the one. He would often talk about, how can I be happy if I know my brother isn't?
Yeah.
And that was very much a collectivistic view and a view of the interrelated, nature of all things, and so. So I think it's first getting, I think, past the idea that we're separated and we're individuals and therefore we have to go into the world and form our. It's systemic.
Yeah, it is.
If you don't see the interrelatedness of all things, if you take yourself only to be an individualized and separate person, you slap on that your misplaced dependencies for love, worth, meaning, and value, then you're going to be a individual person in the world attaching to, wealth, success, prestige, image, identity, accomplishments, possessions, and to achieve the most fundamental things a person wants in life, and that's a dangerous combination of things.
Yes, it is.
And so then it's not any secret. Then you're going to go out into the world and you're going to see other people as a threat, or somebody to compete against, to one up, to be better.
Don't you think at the end of the day that is I've seen this in my own life on a big scale, and I don't think you can go through any kind of quote unquote, spiritual leadership or leadership in the institution and not descend into competition. And more, honestly, Jim, I'm seeing competition as one of the cardinal sins, if you will, that leads us into all the problems we have. Because even with something like what we're doing with Beyond the Box. We've been doing this podcast for a long time, but, I can even see it in myself, as spiritual as I like to think I am, and as developed as sometimes I can deceive myself into thinking I am. I'll find myself comparing what we're doing with what someone else is doing, or how many likes these people have on Facebook, or how many people commented on this status, or, all these things. And then I go, what the hell am I doing? It's like I don't want in this game. I don't want to be in this game. Yeah. And yet you find it seems like so much of our society, and especially American society, because it's all about, if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you work really hard, you'll get the American dream, and but in order to do that, you've got to beat out the next guy for the promotion, and how in your own life have you dealt with that? Because I'm sure, when I hear that, you came from Willow Creek.
Yeah.
That's the mega church of mega churches.
Yeah.
And so when you go out to plant a church, I'm sure that there's these visions of grandeur, that come on you, and you begin to, you go to pastoral meetings and with people in the community, and you begin to compare numbers with them, and you can begin to compare how much God is moving, and
I do. There's that observation that was made that developing a healthy ego is absolutely essential to the first half of your life, and then letting it go is absolutely essential for the second half.
Wow.
So we teach our children to have ego, to develop their individualism, and so that's a very important part of human development. But then some people never get to the second phase where then, you begin to let go of, that ego drive. So a lot of it is identity development. Here, the way a person's identity is developed, we all have a concept and image of ourselves. And the way that identity is developed is largely the way your other people reflected you back to yourself. So in terms of the development of a person's identity, what the primary people in your life first told you about you is a significant part of your development of your identity. If your father told you over and over again, you're stupid, you're stupid, you're stupid, you're stupid, then it's very likely that you're going to develop an identity thinking of yourself as stupid. So that's one way that we get to where we're at. I mean, right now, you and I are a product of conditioning, to a certain extent.
To a big degree,
yeah,
it feels like.
Who we are is the sum total of our relationships, our circumstances, our situations, our conditions, and our choices. And for the development of our identity, a significant aspect of that is what we learn about ourselves from other people. But then the other main way that we do this is by comparison. Identity development is so much based on,
It's back to that dualistic thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and we derive our sense of who we are in comparison to other people, and the world is set up that way. I got an A. It doesn't mean anything unless you got a B.
Wow.
Or me weighing this much means a lot if you weigh that much. My financial status is compared to yours, so it's a comparison game, and it's that's a good example of our misplaced dependencies and our attachments to things for the basis of our identity. But so we're confused who we are with what we have. You have a job, you're not your job. You have your financial status, you're not your financial status. You have your career, you're not your career. You have your body, you're not your body. There's all these things we have that we take to be the truth of who we are, and we develop our identity around the things we have and not who we really are.
Man.
And I mean, you can start. I mean, we can sit right now and say, okay, I have a chair, but I'm not a chair. I have a coat, but I'm not a coat. Those are the easy ones. But then you go through, I have a car, but I'm not my car. But we know that the reason why people buy cars is they watch the commercials and believe, if I'm driving this kind of car, it means I'm this kind of person.
Well, and even, Jim, what's interesting about you saying that is even when you, even for people who aren't buying expensive cars, you still are buying a certain kind of car, because if you don't buy, you don't want a clunker when you go to work, because then people are going to look down on you and they're going to think you're not in the same socioeconomic class as them, so that they can relate to you. So it affects everyone. It's not just, we hear stuff like that and we automatically think, well, that's just for those people that are having plastic surgery and driving Rolls Royces.
Right.
But it's all of us, right?
Or, it's our spirituality is the same. Is that this gets back to the idea of our spiritual evolution. And you can't, you're at different places over the course of your life in terms of where you're at spiritually. Is that neither are you your current thoughts about God. So there is a you that's independent of that, but we get attached to that. That's why they're so important to us. Is that our beliefs about God are often fundamental to our identity, and so then when somebody questions them, then we feel like it's questioning our very basic identity.
Our core,
and that's why even the book, Notes from Over the Edge, I said, a person should be cautious about taking what anybody says and making it their gospel truth.
Yeah.
Don't ever believe something because I said it or because some
guru said it.
Right.
Yeah.
It has to be. You have to listen to and follow the spirit of truth within yourself. You have to throw it against the wall in terms of your own personal experience and reality. Just because somebody else said it, and it doesn't make it true. I mean, even so to not to pour concrete over your latest discovery or to develop your identity around being a progressive spiritual person, and it's an easy thing, for a person to get to, but that's no different. It's no different at all from equating your identity from what you drive or how much money's in the bank or what your position is.
You just really said it, because that's something that really hit me, Jim. Is for Steve and I, when we came out of institutional Christianity, we started meeting together for breakfast on a regular basis and just really deconstructing our journeys, and just it was important to us to have someone else. We both were in the same boat. And we didn't know anybody else in our lives that we could talk to about this stuff, because, Steve was out of the institution and filling all of these inklings in a different direction, both not just practically, but doctrinally and in every other way. And I was too. And so, we began to have these conversations, and then we started the podcast out of that. And it was like, there's probably other people that don't have a conversation partner that they can just listen into our conversations. So we just plugged up a mic and started, just talking into a mic just like we would talk normally. And anyway, in the course of that, you really begin to see that it is such a temptation to pour concrete on where you're at.
Yeah.
That people, with our identity being established first and foremost because we left the institution, we needed someone to talk to.
Yeah.
It became really easy for our identity to become anti-institutionalism and anti-religion and the institutional model of church. And something that you said in the book, you were just talking about ego, that really struck me, is you gave this illustration of Rosa. Can you tell people about that, and maybe the danger of how we often develop an oppositional identity that we're basically going back to that dualistic thinking you're talking about earlier. We begin to define our identity as a direct result of what we're against in a very negative way instead of a positive way, and how we move beyond that. How do we get to a place where my identity is not, I'm not creating my identity as a result of being against your identity, but I am who I am.
Yeah, well, two things you said all kind of tying together. One is the importance of dialogue and conversation, because I think that a lot of people can get hung up in their head, with their thoughts about things, and it's really useful to take it into dialogue and conversation, which is one of the great, I think, contributions that, Beyond the Box offers. Is because I can't tell you how many emails I get from people who are saying, I just wish I could find somebody that I could talk to without a threat of judgment, who I could share all this stuff that I'm thinking about with other people who think the same thing. And I've said it so many times about the book Notes from Over the Edge, is don't sit in your house and read it. Try to get it out in dialogue and conversation with other people. I think it's really critical, and the issue of identity too, just putting words to it, discussing, talking about it, getting it out as something to dialogue about. In the book, I tell the story of, we have a level of self-awareness that we can that can trip us up. And I just told as an illustration, not all living things have the same sort of level of ego or self-awareness a human being has, like a flower. If a flower did have that self-awareness and was to proceed down the same path that we did, then it might be a situation that, a flower in a garden takes on self-awareness, and it begins to notice what, makes it distinct, its color, its size, its petals, its smell, but that level of self-awareness, becomes corrupted when the flower, looks out at other flowers in the garden and then starts to make the comparisons. Mm-hmm. That flower over there looks a little perkier, its petals look a little more beautiful, it's taller, it stretches out to the sun more than I do. It appears to be gathering, more attention, in the garden and so on. And then the need to either enhance your appearance or degrade somebody else. You got a couple options there if you're going down the road. You either got to make yourself better, or you got to somehow make somebody else worse in your mind. And of course, this is what we do every day in the world. Is we're either trying to find ways to prop up our own sense of self-importance, or we're trying to tear someone else's down, because therefore we can feel better, about who we are. And that even, to some extent relates back to our misunderstanding about our relatedness to all other people.
Yeah.
Every person is my mother. Every person is my father. Every person is my brother, sister, son, or daughter. So I have a sense of solidarity and love and compassion with every human being. That it's that the person that I pass is not a person to overcome or compete against. It's my.
They're not an obstacle on the way to my goal.
Right. They're as close to me as any other. The most closest person there could be to me in terms of being an object of my concern. I don't only desire my own well-being, but I desire their well-being, and I want to make a contribution to it.
Yeah.
The liberation of all humankind. That we don't separate a piece out of it, and we become content with our own sense of accomplishment or identity. But we recognize the solidarity of the entire human family, and I think Jesus was a stand for that kind of human solidarity.
Yeah.
He's referred to in the Bible as the second Adam.
Yeah.
The first Adam went out and did it the way we're talking about now.
Yeah.
Out of spiritual ignorance, went into the world, divided it up, conquered. And the rest of the story is there. We've been doing it
and
ever since.
Even the good and evil thing. I mean, even the idea, like what you were talking about earlier about making these conceptualizations. That, or meaning, attaching meaning to things, that things are good or things are bad.
Yeah.
That's even what Adam did. Instead of responding to those situations as they came along, things were looked at in terms of good and bad, which didn't really contribute to.
Yeah, and Jesus comes along, and I think you referred to this either in an earlier conversation or even during our conversation here, that Jesus comes along and says, to the extent you express that compassion to the least of the human family, consider it that you were rendering this kind of care and compassion to me directly.
Yeah.
So it's it takes time. It's not like the folks on the Titanic didn't see the iceberg, but you can't turn around the Titanic on a dime.
Good luck making a U-turn, right?
Right. So it's the same thing, is that, we've learned to live our lives out of this spiritual ignorance and in all these different ways, we've been conditioned into it. So it's tough to turn that sucker around on a dime. So, we have to recondition ourselves, and the best way to do that is simply to be aware, to have awareness.
Let me ask you with that, because this is something that I often run amok with, I guess, is like sometimes I think I'm we'll do a little ray therapy here, okay? I'll lay on the couch here. Sometimes I feel like I'm hypersensitive to the plight of others. And, when we talk about the interconnectivity of the human race, now because of social media and the internet and all these things, we're more and more connected to people across the world that we never would have heard about. So like the other day, I'm reading this article on Yahoo while I'm at work about mentally ill people in Africa and how they're locked up away from society, and some of them are chained to a tree for 10 years out in the elements because people don't know what to do with them.
Yeah.
I read that kind of stuff, Jim, and it tears me up. And in reality, there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. And yet, I genuinely feel the interconnectivity to those people on the other side of the planet. I mean, I feel I feel deeply. You know, I feel the plight and the pain of these people around the world. And to be honest with you, I put myself through hell as a result of it.
Yeah.
Because I feel when I read stuff like that, or you know, I see one of those commercials with starving children or whatever, I feel overwhelmed, almost to the point of just where, you know, it'll ruin the rest of my day.
Yeah.
And there's part of me that's like, well, that's a good thing, because I want to feel deeply. I want to. I don't want to just go through my life while others are suffering and not give a shit. You know, I don't want to be like that.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, how do you? I feel like that can hamstring me to where I can beat myself up because I'm not doing something about it, and therefore miss out on living in that present moment, like we talk about.
Yeah.
Do you deal with that same kind of thing? And if so, how have you found yourself?
Yeah,
coping?
I mean, it's a unique human scenario. It's unique to our time. You know, of course, it's not always been this way historically. I mean, if we had lived at a different time, we would have known very little that was going on beyond a 50-mile radius from where we lived, you know, including, you know, Jesus himself.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, there was an east to west trade route, of course, and information about what was going on in the world was being passed along, but the globalization has significantly impacted the way we experience life, you know, our lives.
Yeah.
I mean, the intensification of the technological tools and the profit for motive, or the profit for economic motive, has globalized the world in a way where, you know, we now, as you said, you know
everything that happens.
We know everything that's, you know, going on everywhere. You know, so I think that one of the most difficult concepts or a challenging thing to ponder, or a path to get on to ponder it, would be maybe rethinking to some extent the way that we think about carrying or our involvement in the world as strictly transactional. Like, there's person A, and they have something they're going to give to person B, and that's the way the world turns around. Person A in Africa needs this, or I'm person A, person B in Africa needs this, and so now I feel a compulsion or a guilt or a internal turmoil because I can't seem to work that out in that paradigm. You know, how can I be the person A to give the thing that's needed to the person B over there? So we partly, I think, is we get sort of bound up in the ways that we think about it. Like, and that would be one. Yeah. Is that, you know, transactional, you know, compassion is a model very difficult to carry in a world where, you know, we're very far removed from scenarios where that transaction can be real.
I mean, I imagine you yourself, I mean, working with International Justice Mission.
Right, and people all the time would say, you know, that I would go around and speak to people, you know, around the country and universities and churches. So a lot of people come up to me after and say, you know, well, what can I possibly do to help the girl who's being raped, you know, in somewhere in Asia? And, you know, there is a trail, you know, I mean, from the standpoint that, you know, forced child prostitution, you know, is very much driven by Western sex tourism. Western sex tourism is, you know, more or less, it is in some way influenced by the objectification of women. The objectification of women happens through the messages that we receive or that we take on or subject ourselves to in terms of, of women. So if you really follow that trail all the way back, a huge contribution that you could make is live a life of truth. Don't go through the world carrying the view of objectifying women.
Wow.
Be a stand for the truth, of our equivalent and inherent worth, whatever gender, and shift the conversation and the sentiment away from the objectification of women, because eventually where the objectification of women goes is to a girl in Southeast Asia who's being raped 5 times a day, 6 days a week.
Dude.
So that's one way to look at it, is that it's systemic. The word, there's one good thing. There's pros and cons about globalization, but the one thing it does help us to perhaps see, if you dig into it, is that you perhaps have a greater appreciation for how systemic the problems of the world are. So the little bit that you're actually, the contribution you're making in your daily life along the everyday paths of life actually has a relationship to, to what's happening, because what's happening anywhere in the world is just a symptom of the system as a whole, in which we're all participating in and creating and building every day. We're not going to be able to change what's happening in other parts of the world until we dismantle the system, and that's not going to happen unless we dismantle it first in our own lives. That's God is going to be the change you have to see in the world. It ultimately has to change our way of being. That the world is not so much changed, I think, in terms of people just taking on isolated actions here or there. It's more of a transformation of our way of being.
You really, what you're saying is really resonating with me. One of the things that you talked about in the book was kind of or my takeaway from it. There's what you write and what someone reads, right? But was like the idea of the pebble, being thrown in the pond, and that everything we do has ripples out. And you talked about that one of the best things we can do to heal the world is to heal ourselves. And you, I think you beautifully said that right now with that the objectification of women, that where it leads is to that place. So maybe you were talking earlier about in the institutional church how you come out of Willow Creek and it's like, we're going to start a revolution, we're going to start a movement, we're going to do these great things for God. And that often, really the greatest thing that we can do for God are really the small things that have that pebble impact, that ripple impact that ends up, like at work, I'm at work sometimes and I'll hear people, like you said, objectifying women. And the other day, it just kind of rose up in me to say something, and because they were talking about, I don't remember, looking at pornography or, watching some movie, or anyway, it was just basically talking about a woman's body, and, and I said something. Oh, I know what it was. There was somebody I work with was talking about, what would I do if I caught my boys looking at pornography or something like that. And I think they expected, because they knew I used to be a pastor, they know all this stuff, so sometimes they're careful about cussing around me or, whatever. And I think they expected me to take the quote-unquote moral high road and talk about how God frowned upon that. And I was like, I don't think it matters what God thinks about it. What matters is, I don't want my boys objectifying women and looking at these pictures and looking at women as an object that's only there to fulfill their sexual pleasure.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying, Jim, is like right on. And even right now, I just feel this resonance in me of that, Jesus was, the Bible says he was a man that he was associated with our griefs and our sorrows, that he got it. And simultaneously, he was anointed with the oil of gladness and joy above all the other people around him.
Yeah.
So that there's this paradoxical joy and sharing in the suffering and grief of others, and that those things aren't mutually exclusive. And it seems like through our dualistic mind that you talk about, that we have a tendency to either get into the joy and the pleasure and the gratification of life, and in order to do so, like many times the people I work with, going back to that same thing, I'm kind of Debbie Downer sometimes. I'll talk about something that's going on in the third world, and I can tell they look at me and they're like, oh my gosh, can we get past this so we could talk about what we're going to do this weekend, right? And so there's this one tendency to either shut out the pain of the world,
right,
so that we can have a good time, or there's another tendency to be so overcome by it that we can never have a good time. And it seems like it's such a hard balance.
It is a hard balance, because for myself, I exert initiative to be aware of what's happening in the world, in different ways. Something just as simple as, I related to a lot of people. I'm connected with a lot of people around the world anyway, because of a lot of the things that I do, but I'll watch BBC News because you're not going to get it through American media really. What's actually going on.
What's the real story, right?
Yeah. Well, that's not even. But it's more finding out what's kind of unfolding, around the world. I want to know what's my mother, my father, my sister, my brother, my son, and my daughter. In Bosnia. In Kenya, wherever, what is it like for them right now in terms of their human experience, but it all comes back to the same things, all the problems of the world ultimately come down to spiritual ignorance, not seeing things as they really are, and then all we do is go out and act on that ignorance in all the ways we do in terms of greed and violence, and and so if it's true that the world is basically connected through wave particles, and that our being awake and alive to the truth and being expressions of that each day, is reconditioning the system as a whole.
Yeah. And
we have to have an earnest desire to live our lives, according to the truth, so that that can happen, that change can occur, and Jesus is a good example of this. Jesus did live in a time where he would have had the media piping in conditions around the world, and live what otherwise was a pretty ordinary life, pretty limited or constrained to his particular circumstances and his moment in history and his geography, and it's different for every person. There's not like a one size fits all. What it means for one person to respond to a situation as it requires. I know there's someone might turn on a TV and see a story about poverty on the other side of the world and decide that they want to go to that part of the world. Yeah. Another person may. So that there's in terms of all of our judgments, we also do this about this where we create a judgment about how things should be done or what we should do, or that there's sort of like a script. Like somebody give me a script on how I'm supposed to do this, how am I supposed to respond, what am I supposed to do in the face of so much suffering in the world. But there really isn't a script. There's not like, we get back to the comparison game, that, this person's doing that, so I guess I should be doing this.
Yeah.
And, we get kind of tangled up in that all over again.
Don't you think that's the problem with institutional religion, is that everybody's given a one-size-fits-all script that we tend to feel like we have to abide by instead of really living in the moment and letting the answer come to us for each situation.
Yeah, and following that internal guidance. Listening to yourself. What does this situation require of me? And what is my intuition? What is my gut? What strikes me, as what is the response that I, should give to this, particular situation. That's the thing is we generally people just, like they there's something about us that wants the script. When we roll up to the stop sign and there's a homeless person selling the paper, like we
want a one-size-fits-all. Tell me what to do.
This is what we should do or not do or whatever. And it's kind of back to the it's sort of symptomatic of that thing where we have to do our own thinking. We have to learn to listen to our own, intuition, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to all these questions.
Yeah. You said something in the book that I thought was really interesting about fear. You said that outsourcing or externalizing your well-being creates a life of fear. Can you talk some about fear and how fear is the result of outsourcing our well-being?
Well, I think that because we often believe that what we most desire we're separated from, then the moment we attain some measure of it, the next moment we fear losing it because we become dependent on it. And so, we fear economic loss, partly because we have a misplaced dependency on our financial status for worth and value. So our lives become very much driven by fear because the world becomes, our lives are very unstable and insecure because we are outsourcing our worth, our meaning, our significance, our freedom. We're outsourcing it out to a world of impermanence, and so there's we can't help then to be carried along by the fear of not getting something or getting it and then losing it, and the world there becomes a threat. We live very fear-based lives, as opposed to going out in the world starting from a place of freedom and well-being and peace and a sense of self as whole and complete. That doesn't need achievement, attainment, accumulation in order to to make that happen. It's like that. It's the same thing with love, that fundamentally, we're not in the world to try to find love. I mean, we are love, we came from love, we're returning to love. The deal now is we're here with the opportunity to be a human expression of love. So we don't have to, we're not running through the world trying to
attain something.
And yet, there's probably no place of fear comes up. We fear when it comes to relationships, we have them, we lose them. There's a lot of fear about finding love, not having love, maintaining love. So we start from a deficit because we believe we're separated from these things. And, we do the same thing that Adam and Eve did when they noticed, when their separation. And we go out and we commit violence and we do all kinds of things in order to get what we think that we do not have.
Basically, all that stuff's fig leaves, aren't they? Impermanent fig leaves to cover a situation. Wow. I never thought of it like that.
So ultimately, every news story that's piped in from around the world and the pain and hardship and difficulty, it all relates back to that way of being. It's all related to the same thing. It's not complicated in terms of tracking it back to its source. And so we really have to address the source, which are the fundamental flaws and the ignorance of the way things are. The world is actually fine the way it is. All the ugly stuff we're creating and doing to each other, and we're doing that out of ignorance. So, there's not, other than that, there's nothing else wrong with the world. Now, there may be some things that we don't like about the human existence, which is impermanence. I mean, if we lose a loved one, we grieve that loss, but it doesn't make that wrong. It just makes it human. And some aspects of the human journey are not always easy to take.
Well, in light of that, and this is part of the thing that I'm still very much I guess more in traditional thinking on is like with death. When the Bible talks about death being the last enemy, and the Bible, the Gospels emphasize the resurrection of Jesus as the defeat of death. And yet I know in the book, and now you're talking about saying that death is not wrong. Talk a little bit about that in light of...
Well, first off, if death is wrong, then we'd have to say that every person who's ever been a human being, including Jesus, was wrong. Because they all tasted death, including Jesus. So we got a problem to start if we make death wrong. It's not like anybody's ever not died.
Right.
There are some stories. Someone might take issue with
Enoch
that here
or
and there.
Elijah
For the most part, the human journey includes death, which is not a problem. It's only it's only symptomatic of the way the human journey is, and that is that it's impermanent.
Yeah.
Everything shares. Every human element shares the same dynamic. It's born, it comes into being, it goes through change, and it goes away. Nothing is outside of that law of change and impermanence. And that is a large extent to why we suffer, because we want things to be permanent and they're not, because they all share this basic essence of impermanence. And no, we're fine with that when we think about the seed that falls to the ground and dies and gives it, but we're not comfortable with it when it comes to human death, and it's not. We're not comfortable with it because it's difficult, as part of the human journey that we don't like. But again, are beyond the grief and loss of the ones we love that are a natural response to death. The additional suffering and mental anguish that we have around death is because we attach our meaning to it that's not there. We attach further meaning to it. I think that in essence, Jesus unmasked death for, its lack of power or the significance that we attach to it. Death is... it's not what we've made it out to be. Death is the seed falls to the ground and it dies and it comes alive. We don't see people distraught that this is what happens with a seed, but we're distraught when it happens to a human being. But it's because of our misunderstanding of what death is, and our inability to accept that grieving painful loss is just part of the human journey. It's not the wrong part of it. It's just part of it. Truth, what is true, is permanent. What is true cannot be improved upon, and it can't be diminished. You can take the truth, you can mock it, you can try to refute it, you can beat it, you can whip it, you can nail it to a cross and kill it, but it does nothing at all. Yeah. To what's real. What's real is not subject to that impermanence. Our birth certificate is not the truth of who we are. Our birth certificate only marks the specific coordinates relative to our human journey. Your self existed before you took on human personhood, and it will exist after it's gone. You are not your mind, you're not your body. You were given these to have a human journey, and those will end. They're deteriorating right now. Your body right now is different than when you were 20. Yeah. And your mind has too. And that your body and your mind will continue to deteriorate. You might, become, incapacitated physically. You might become senile mentally. That's what's going to happen to the equipment, because that's the nature of it. Modern medicine helps us out to deal with this and to manage it and to eke out, a longer and more, efficient human existence. But it's never going to strip away the fundamental nature of all phenomena in the world, which is that it's impermanent.
Well, one of the things I think of in light of what you're saying, and this is something where I'm trying to work through in my own heart and mind, is when we were talking earlier about the incarnation of Jesus, and the truth of that is that God's best revealed in humanity. That God and humanity, that there's no separation. And in thinking about that, one of the things that it seems like the incarnation is I can't, the word's escaping me right now, but kind of like a confirmation or a validation. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a validation of our humanity.
Yeah.
And in thinking of that, in thinking of once we die and then we go on to something else,
Yeah.
it almost seems like that the incarnation was a statement of that God's will is to abide in humanity.
Yeah.
And that the resurrection is kind of like God's statement of saying, even with the impermanence in the world, that not only in Jesus' resurrection, but in our resurrection, and I'm someone that, I believe in a form of universal salvation, where eventually we're all going to get to God and however God's going to do that, I don't know. I believe it's through Jesus, but I don't know how he does it.
Yeah.
But in saying that it seems to me, at least, that we don't come here and then move on to something else, but that this is the point, that the kingdom of God, that Jesus' message is, heaven's not the point, this is the point.
Yeah.
And that through resurrection, he's validating that experience and saying it will remain the point.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Or?
It does, and there's a lot of room to explore, what that is. Like, for example, reincarnation is a way of thinking about how the human reality continues to exist, and we continue to take expression in it in one way or another. One of the interesting things about in terms of even cultural differences, and this comes up particularly in religious differences, is that one of the differences is that some religions have more of a short-term view, and Christianity is one of them. I mean, it's kind of like your human life is your one and done, and there's some other aspects of our view of existence that are more short-term oriented. Buddhism, for example, is very long-term oriented. I mean, Buddhism talks in terms of what's called kalpas, and a kalpa is the beginning. A universe begins, it goes through its development, it goes through entropy, and then it's gone. A Buddhist believes there's thousands of kalpas. Like, this is just one universe, and we only might be a small part, just a speck in that one universe, and this universe had a beginning, it's going through its evolution, it's going to one day come to an end, and then there's going to be another universe. And so Buddhists have a more long-term view, which is that there's, countless kalpas, entire universes that begin and then go away and come back again. So I think that what we know for sure is that we have the human journey that we have right now. We know that for sure. Like I was talking to a gal the other day who's, saying, well, I'm just, I don't know what the meaning of life is. I'm very frustrated by this. And sometimes, it's like I wonder, do I want to live? Because I can't answer this question, what's the meaning of life? Mm. And so our conversation was, well, let's just start with this. You have a life. Okay, we know this for sure, right? You have one. Okay, so if you have a life, which you do, then the next question is what sort of life do you really want this to be? Let's go down that path, because we can discuss why you have one, but you have one now. Yeah. So let's build on that basic fact. Yeah. So in terms of what actually unfolds after this human experience that we're having right now, what happens? Like what evolves? It's hard to know. I mean, I'm not sure we can know.
Yeah.
We can, I think, draw upon those things that I think, that are fundamentally true, which is that your true self, has a sense of permanency, and that permanency can be joined with impermanency, because that's what we have right now.
Yeah, we're living that reality, right?
Right. Now, whether there's like another human experience that's more permanent, is absent of some of the impermanence, I don't know. I mean, I'm not there.
Yeah.
I've never, if there is, I don't know what it is because I've not experienced it.
Well, I think we have to have like an epistemological humility, to say that we don't know. I guess I find myself relating to the idea or believing the idea or whatever that somehow God's creation in us, the way we are, is that while it's transient right now, that somehow through Jesus that I don't know, that resurrection is really it resonates with me.
Yeah.
But I totally hear what you're saying, because I think we have to. We know what's right in front of us. Anything beyond that, we have to be honest. Even if we are an Orthodox Christian who, still dots his I's and crosses his T's, even someone like that has to express that their belief, they're taking it on faith, right?
Well, the interesting thing is, if you do study other religions, and I teach world religions and stuff like this, but it's interesting that in some world religions, some religions believe that there are several realms, and that the human realm is actually the most beneficial realm for transformation. That, in other words, that the other thing that maybe we don't think about is the aspect of choice, that maybe we're here because we chose to, and maybe we could come back to the human experience by choice. Maybe there isn't a one-size-fits-all the way down the line, even when it comes to what happens after our physical death in this lifetime. That maybe it's just not a conveyor belt kind of mentality where it's all the same thing for everybody.
Yeah.
Maybe there is some choice involved in terms of what happens for you. Where you go, what reality you're in, what experience that you have, may not be the same for every person.
Yeah.
It may have a lot to do with what they choose to want to do.
Yeah.
That's, if I could, with the friend I was talking to about the meaning of life, one of the things that I guess I was sort of wanting them to ponder is the idea that they were here because they chose to be here. And that we took on the characteristics of human personhood, perhaps for a reason that's very individual. It may not be this kind of grandiose thing that we're trying to seek out on why we're here. Having said all that, it's interesting though that we sure experience a lot of personal suffering in this life, and sometimes I kind of feel like that there are even some religions that don't get too involved in trying to address questions of the afterlife.
Yeah.
Instead they focus more on other kinds of questions. So there's an extent to where we are kind of enculturated and conditioned to the kinds of questions that we get really interested in.
That's very true.
Like the ones that we really get stirred up about or we get focused on. And I think it's different for different people that also. I think it kind of all a little bit gets connected back to our thing about dualism. Our tendency, though, is to make one thing right and something else wrong. And that's the human experience is one of those, is that religion is always finding it to be wrong, which is why going to heaven is always the solution, because everything about the human experience is wrong.
Yeah.
You know, and it's very difficult to kind of get the message through that it's not wrong. It's kind of one of those, it is what it is. Now, the wrong part, or the suffering part, we're actually creating and adding to it. But the fact that if you hit your hand with a hammer, it's going to hurt. You know, if you knock your head on concrete, you're going to have stitches. If someone you love dies, you're going to be in emotional pain. Physical pain and emotional pain is a part of the human experience. There's nothing wrong with that, and that's never going to change, however enlightened a person might be.
That's
but
right.
It's all our attachments to what we make that all mean that creates that deep inner anguish and suffering. You know, a teenage girl, you know, can break her nail and experience a tremendous amount of suffering because of the attachment and the meaning she's applied to her appearance.
Or like how many girls have you heard that when they were 15 their hair was cut and it was
Right.
very traumatic?
Right, and
Yeah.
it could be another person, another situation going through what appears to us to be absolute horrific human conditions, but their suffering and the mental anguish they're going through is different because they're not attaching to those conditions the same thing that the high school, you know, girl who lives, you know, in Bill Mead, you know, gets a broken nail and she's, you know, experiences great, you know, suffering.
Yeah.
You know, people, you know, almost one person a day, I think it was one person a day, somewhere around almost one person a day jumps off the Golden Gate Bridge. You know, in San
Wow.
Francisco, the kid, I watched a
Wow.
documentary of it a while back.
Wow.
Don't quote me on that, of course. I remember seeing a tremendous number of people jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. It's kind of the romanticized, you know, way of killing yourself.
Wow.
You know, but think about the reasons why all those people are jumping. And a lot of them are going to be because they're attached to something. Another person might be experiencing something that from the outside looking in is much more horrendous, but it's not, they're not attaching the same meaning to it.
Yeah, wow.
You
That's
know,
huge.
people jump off that bridge because of, you know, a boyfriend breaks up with them, because, you know, they've, you know,
Or, what
people have said bad things about them, or
Yeah.
they've become, you know, for all sorts of reasons, you know.
what you're saying makes a lot of sense because, you know, you think about it like when the financial crash happened back in 2008.
Yeah.
You know, you think about how many people committed suicide over that. And the irony is you've got people who are happy as a lark living in a little, you know, thatch roof shack in Africa. And there's other people that are committing suicide because their bank account just went down from 8 figures to 7 figures.
Right.
You know?
And even that sort of like discuss that, you know, mentioning that about suicide is still a great generalization. I mean, it's
Sure.
I mean, there's we.
But it's all about meaning. Like you're saying, it's all about the meaning we attach. It's
Right.
really the...
And then there are, you know, I mean, and just being associated with people who have killed themselves and with people who have had other people that they love who have killed themselves and so on. You know, suicide is an interesting issue on its own, and it can't really be stereotyped. I mean, there's a lot of people who make a very conscious decision in their lives, and we're on the outside looking in and can make a judgment of it being
Yeah.
right or wrong, but it's not necessarily always the result of a misplaced dependency.
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
you know, I mean, I don't, you know, so it's complicated.
Yeah.
You know, why a
Yeah.
person might choose it. You know, and I tend not to try to make, you know, I mean, all that to say is that it's complicated, and I'm sure, you know, it's different in every situation.
Yeah. Here's the thing I love about talking with you, Jim, and reading your books is that your focus on the here life. The fact that regardless, you know, we're having this conversation about resurrection or reincarnation or whatever, you know, that whether or not we agree on that your emphasis on the here life is so important because it's something that for so long that we've missed. And the other thing I love about talking with you is how you stretch my thinking. You know, the fact that through your books, through talking with you now, through your Facebook posts, that you really stretch people and help us look at things from new angles. So I just love what you're doing.
Yeah.
I say keep up the good work because I love it. I love what you're doing. Tell me what's on the horizon. Have you got any projects that are coming down the pike, or are you just wiping the sweat from your brow from the newest book?
No, I mean I've got some different things going on. I'm starting a 21-day cohort group with a group of people who've read Notes from Over the Edge, and I think I'm going to be doing some of those because I like I said before, I do place a lot of value on the conversation and dialogue. Not just shutting yourself in the room and reading a book. So I've got one of those coming up in March. I usually keep fairly busy. Teaching. I'm an adjunct professor here in Nashville, and so 3 classes keeps me pretty busy in terms of the teaching and the administrative part of it. For me, being useful is, I've decided to run for school board here in.
Oh, wow!
Yeah, so I figured I'd make myself useful and.
You got your hands on all sorts of pots.
Yeah, so I don't know what's going to happen with that. It's a learning curve. I've never run for any kind of elected office before, but I am an educator, and I got 2 girls in public schools, and so there's a way that it makes sense that the situation of my life and the community I live in, that's something that I've gotten some interested in, have some interest in and kind of pursuing. I'm still working on the religion-free Bible.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about that. I was reading a little bit about, and you actually quote some in the book.
Well, my plan, it's a significant undertaking that involves more people than myself, but I think what's likely to happen is to release sections of it, to release it in sections, and it's a paraphrase that, when I was in seminary, we talked about doing exegesis, which is pulling the meaning out of the passage, until what you realize is you've actually been doing eisegesis, which is you reading
into it.
So this is an attempt to look at the Bible, what you might see if you back out some of the fundamental premises that one tends to read into the Bible, in the way we interpret it, the language we use. Even think about Jesus saying, repent for the kingdom of God. Well, see, now we understand repent in a certain way. So we're reading that into the Bible.
Yeah.
The word repent comes from the Greek word metanoia, and it generally doesn't mean even the word sin. See, now we're adding our meaning to the word sin that we've brought to the Bible, rather than, maybe looking at it once you back out some of that religious programming. Some of the most misunderstood words in the Bible are, repent, sin.
The basic stuff.
Right.
we think it's just stuff like eschatology, but it's even the most basic
things. Yeah. So I'm working on that, on the side, and still trying to get back to doing my running and
all the endurance. I don't know how you do that.
I don't do it as much as I used to, but I'm trying to build my way kind of back into that. And so Heather stays busy. She's got an Etsy business that she does, and life just there's a lot of moving parts to it. Whitney's in the Navy and she's in Seattle. And so, so there's just lots of stuff
going on. So tell our listeners, how can they get in touch with you? If they're not already liking you on Facebook, or they're not already following what's going on in your life, how can they connect with you?
Probably the best. My email is nobody.jimpalmer@gmail.com. And I created that email after I wrote Divine Nobody, so that's the reason for it. Nobody.jimpalmer@gmail.com. jimpalmerblog.com is my blog, and I'm in different places in social media: Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Pinterest, Goodreads, Amazon. So one way or another, you can track me.
And we'll put some links when we post the episode. We'll put some links.
Oh, good, yeah. Because I was thinking today about posting, because I have some of my friends and stuff on Facebook.
Absolutely.
Kind of interested in hearing.
We'll shoot the links to you.
Hopefully, I didn't say anything that
Oh no! This
friend count plummets.
Well, now I can't answer that question. But I can tell you.
Whenever I need to weed out some friends, I know what to post, so I can make some room for some new ones.
Jim Palmer, amazing time. Thank you so much.
It was great being on. I appreciate, of course, just we all contribute to each other. So
Absolutely.
I'm grateful for, the ways you stretch me, the way Beyond the Box stretches me. I mean, we're all students, we're all teachers, we all have something to learn from each other. So
Amen.
Thank you also for who you are and what you're doing and the way you stretch my own, thinking about and living of this journey we're on.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Jim Palmer, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me, to engage in this conversation, to be willing to put yourself out there. There's just so many of us out there that resonate with so many of the things you're saying. I see on a regular basis that people are sharing your status updates on Facebook, that people are resonating with a blog post that you've written or a book that you've written. There's just so many of us out there that really appreciate your voice and just say thank you. And folks, I just really hope you enjoyed this conversation. I know, like I said, that there's probably a lot of things that you found resonance with. There might be some things that you didn't resonate with. As you heard Jim and I discuss, there's some things that we disagree on. But that should be the last thing that keeps us from being able to share life and to be able to talk these things through and to be able to think together. Jim has just helped me to grow in so many areas and really helped me to be free in my walk with God and in my pursuit of truth. So Jim, thank you so much, not only for taking the time to be on the podcast, but also for just putting yourself out there and for helping so many of us on this road that we're journeying with God, not as a professional, not as someone who has all the answers, but as a fellow journeyman and a fellow traveler. Thank you so much, Jim. Folks, thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I would love to hear what you have to say. I know a lot of the ideas in this episode are going to be really great food for fodder. I can't even talk on the Facebook page. So please just jump in the conversation. If you've not joined our Facebook group, please do that. We'll start the bumper right now, and you can hear all of the different ways that you connect with us. However you connect with us, we just hope you do. We just thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for being a part of the community that is Beyond the Box. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Box. We would love to connect with you online, and we have several ways for you to add your voice to the Beyond the Box community.
To join our Facebook group, visit facebook.com/groups/BTB podcast discussion. This group is a safe place to talk about your journey and to think through your walk with God.
While you're there, you can like our Facebook page to receive updates on new podcasts and happenings at facebook.com/beyondthebox.
You can also visit our website, beyondtheboxpodcast.com, where you can hear all of our previous podcast discussions, submit ideas for future episodes, check out our blog, and even call us to leave your audio comment or idea.
Look for the Call Me widget on the right-hand side of the screen where you can enter your name and phone number to have our answering machine call you, or you can call us directly at 626-24-NO-BOX. That's 626-246-6269.
However you choose to connect with us, we just hope you do. You are a welcome part of the community that is
Beyond the Box.
Beyond the Box.
Beyond the Box.
Beyond the Box. Beyond the Box.